next speaker is Owen Thomas. He's a senior transport planner and project manager working in the Department of Transport MAX light rail project. He previously worked on the state's 20-year public transport plan, the Ellenbrook Bus Rapid Transit System, and on the planning for the Murdoch Activity Center. At the Public Transport Authority, Owen was part of the team planning day-to-day operations of Perth's public transport system. So please join me in welcoming Owen Thomas.
Okay, thanks for having me along tonight. I have got something in here about MAX, but I'm actually going to speak more broadly about the work that's been happening at a state level in relation to our strategic public transport and land use planning and the relationships that we're trying to build between the two. And I hope that it touches on some of the points that Kerry and Peter have made in response to how the two work very closely hand in hand, and so you can see what the state's doing to try and improve how we plan both transport and land use. So hopefully most of you are aware of Directions 2031, which was published in 2010. It's the state's spatial strategy for Perth over the next 20 years and beyond. It's supportive of a more compact and environmentally sustainable city, and acknowledges not just the need for new urban development areas, but to work within the city that we have and to use the infrastructure and the land that we have more efficiently within the existing city. Ultimately, it's a strategy for 3.5 million when we get there, and we're heading there pretty quickly at the moment. Interestingly, when it was published in 2010, it was based on a population by 2031 of 2.2 million. The more recent growth projections that came out with the WA Tomorrow projections in 2012 are that Perth is going to reach 2.44 million by 2026, which is a 16% faster growth than Directions is based on. And if you take that out to 2031 just as a linear extrapolation, that means that we'll be at 2.7 million by 2031. So that's an extra 500,000 over what was envisaged. So there's some questions about how quickly we will reach those populations, but we're certainly growing very quickly at the moment. Sitting then within Directions 2031 is a consistency in planning. The land use outcomes that Directions aspires to are oriented around a hierarchy of strategic and specialised activity centres. So as Peter alluded to, the polycentric city, not just the single-centred city. Key focal points for density targets and transport outcomes, including parking management and public transport. The draft 20-year public transport plan that came out, and that I'll speak about, supports, facilitates and is consistent with Directions 2031, so we did a lot of work to align that plan, and in fact it really is a key enabler for achieving the land use outcomes of Directions. And it's also supported by other policy tools across the state, so for example the activity centres policy. Just looking at Perth then, and we've seen some facts and figures. This is some older research but sort of sets us as a benchmark against other cities in terms of population, public transport and private transport growth. What you can see, Perth is the third section on the left compared to all the other capitals in Australia. And the rate of public transport growth and population growth compared to private transport is significant. So we're one of the highest and fastest growing areas in both population and public transport usage. More recently, we actually in 2011-12 had a 6% average increase in public transport use, so that would have put us right at the top of that chart. And a 2.5% growth in population, and we're currently tracking at not far off 3% growth in population, with about 1,000 people a week moving to the metropolitan area. In terms of some of the avoidable social costs of congestion, and many of you have probably seen some of this information before, in 2010 it was estimated that the avoidable social cost from congestion was about 1.2 billion. It's forecast that that will increase by 2020 to over 2 billion, which is about a 70% increase and continuing to rise. So there's a clear mandate that if we want our city to prosper both economically and socially, we need to do things better and more efficiently. At the same time, as Peter showed, the growth of public transport use We've had significant and very successful growth across the network over the last 20 odd years, starting with the electrification of the rail network in the early 90s, the construction of the Joondalup line, more recently the of the Mandurah line. But also you can see in the bus network, which is the grey line, for many of those years there was no growth in the network. It was just a pure response to people needing to travel more efficiently and some rationalisation and improvement to services and reallocation of resources. So even without huge investment in resource, there's a clear demand from the community there for improvement. So what are we predicting in terms of future demands? And this is coming out of the 20-year plan. Travel demand to the CBD and the strategic centres, so like your Murdochs, Stirling, the airport, Joondalups, Midland, etc., will increasingly have to be met by mass transit. Public transport patronage itself is forecast to increase by over 120% to around 760,000 trips a day in the next 15 to 20 years. And the real challenge is to increase the number of jobs in centres outside the central sub-region and particularly outside of the city to facilitate more balanced travel patterns. If you look at the graph in the bottom right, that's showing the last 3 measures of employment self-sufficiency in the major regional areas around the metro area, compared to the black marks, which are the Directions 2031 targets. So for the central sub-region, which is the large chart on near the right, you can see that we're already achieving high self-sufficiency of jobs in there. But the other regions have got a way to go, and interestingly, in the Peel sub-region, which is the far right, since the opening of the Mandurah line, we've actually had a decrease in employment self-sufficiency because the line has facilitated more people living out there and encouraged people to live out there, but it's a lot harder to get the jobs to follow. We find in a lot of our strategic centres, most of the jobs are service-based to support the residential population. They don't offer that diversity of employment that you get in the inner area and in the city. So the draft 20-year plan, the opening statement by the independent panel chair, Stuart Hicks. It was run independently with a panel of experts with some government key representatives sitting on there, but it was really structured around being a recommendation to government of where we think things should go. It was released for comment in July 2011 and proposed a network by 2031, including targeted expansion of the heavy rail network, so up to Yanchep, the airport railway, additional stations on the existing network where warranted. It proposed the introduction of an inner city light rail network, or reintroduction of light rail. It has extensive bus rapid transit and priority lanes to make more efficient use of that existing road infrastructure, and then it's serviced in the background by a network of local bus services that feed into these systems. It was based on a 3-tier hierarchy of services, so heavy rail as the primary mass transit system, but really introducing a more rigorous second tier of road-based rapid transit, so light rail and BRT, based on some core standards or characteristics, so frequency of service, priority over the traffic, functional stations, so there's an acceptance as you improve system frequency and journey times, people are prepared to travel a little bit further to access the networks, legibility of the network, capacity and interchange. The BRT network then is, as I said, it provides more flexibility in terms of services than a fixed track, but doesn't have the same mass transit capabilities as the light rail or the heavy rail. So it's targeted really between the activity centres where it's harder to introduce and where demand may not warrant that higher investment. And it allows for staged implementation, particularly along key development and activity corridors. The Max Light Rail project, which hopefully people are familiar with, is a 21-kilometre first stage network in the inner city. There is some future expansion envisaged in the plan, so the blue network is what we're currently working on. We're also doing planning for the orange lines, so from QE2 to UWA, from Vic Park out to Burswood and Curtin, and then the 20-year plan identifies further expansion of that network, shown by the red dots. The Department of Planning then, and we've come full circle, so that the spatial plan Directions 2031 was then backed up by the public transport plan that really focused on what Directions was trying to achieve from a land use outcome, and to support that with the mass public transport. The spatial plan that the Department of Planning is currently working on then takes the public transport plan and tries to target, okay, we have a broad spatial plan of where we're trying to get higher population densities and development. Where is the actual public transport network that we're going to focus that development around? So it really is an integrated circle of activity. It's focusing on all the local governments in the inner sector, 19 of them, long-term planning across LGA boundaries, so consistency, housing diversity and affordability and choice, urban and activity corridors, etc. There's also a planning framework that the department is working on in collaboration with us for MAX. Again, to try and leverage what land use outcomes, and a big part of MAX is the land use outcomes can we get from this light rail system with such a significant investment. So targeting higher density development in key activity centres and along the corridor. The Department of Transport is also working on a moving people plan, focusing really on how to identify where gaps exist and pressures and deficiencies, but more about how do we better use the existing infrastructure, how are we going to prioritise other modes, so walking, cycling, public transport, freight, private vehicles across the road network, and set priority corridors. So certain corridors may have multiple uses, but we may want to prioritise one or two modes over others as appropriate. And finally, the ongoing agency collaboration. So there has been significant efforts, and personally from working within state, progressive efforts, and quite positive in terms of our collaboration, particularly across transport and planning agencies in the last few years. This has good support right from the top down and is getting recognised at political levels. And also we've managed to establish in the last few years the transport portfolio. So previously, and the three departments, Department of Transport, PTA, Public Transport Authority, and Main Roads still exist as independent organisations, but we now all report to a single Director General. And that's allowing us really, previously when we were providing feedback to the planning agencies and stakeholders on issues, you might have had the three agencies providing different feedback from their own points of view. Now it's very much we have the fights behind closed doors. What are our priorities? What are we trying to get? And we're trying to provide a single collaborative response to make planning for other stakeholders easier, but also so that we can get that balance. So what is the balanced outcome across all modes, not just each agency pushing its own interest area. That's it.
Thank you, Owen.